A millionaire thought his son was dead, lost forever in a tragic accident at sea. But 5 years later, a filthy, barefoot 5-year-old knocks on his door, clutching the exact same painted rock he placed in his baby's crib the day he was born. The boy doesn't speak, just stares. And what happens next will shake everything the grieving father believed was true. Where has this child been all these years? And how did he survive when no one else did? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Simon Alden stood at the helm of his restored yacht, the morning sun warming his face as he watched his wife Leah arrange a checkered blanket on the deck. She moved with careful grace, her auburn hair catching golden highlights in the spring light. Their 6-month-old son Eli dozed peacefully in his carrier beside her, tiny fingers curled into fists. "Perfect day for a maiden voyage," Simon called out, pride swelling in his chest. The 30-foot vessel had been his passion project for the past year. Every free weekend spent sanding, painting, and replacing worn parts until the boat gleamed like new. Leah looked up with a bright smile. "It really is beautiful, Simon. All your hard work paid off." She reached into a canvas tote bag and pulled out a small wooden box. "I packed some special things for today, including this." She held up a smooth, palm-sized rock painted with delicate swirls of blue and gray, forming the shape of a whale. Simon's expression softened at the sight. They had painted it together last summer when Leah was still pregnant. "The whale rock," he said. "I remember you saying it would be perfect for Eli's crib." "A guardian for our little sailor," Leah said, carefully placing it back in the box. She stood and walked to Simon, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Thank you for this day. Just the 3 of us, out on the water." Simon kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. "Wouldn't want it any other way." The morning passed in peaceful contentment as they cruised along the coastline. Eli woke for a feeding, and Leah sat in the shade of the cabin, humming softly as she nursed him. Simon kept one hand on the wheel, occasionally glancing back at his family with quiet joy. It wasn't until early afternoon that Simon noticed the shift in weather. Dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying a sharp chill. "We should head back," he said, already adjusting their course. "That storm's moving in faster than the forecast predicted." Leah looked up from where she was playing with Eli. "It's probably just a passing shower. We've barely been out 3 hours." "I don't like the look of those clouds." Simon's jaw tightened as he studied the darkening sky. "Better safe than sorry." "Simon, you're always so cautious." Leah stood, Eli secure in her arms. "Sometimes you need to trust that things will work out. The weather report said clear skies all day." "Weather reports can be wrong." Simon's voice rose with frustration. "This is exactly why I checked and double-checked all the safety equipment before leaving. We need to—" A sudden gust of wind cut him off, strong enough to make the boat lurch. Eli started crying, and Leah stumbled, catching herself against the cabin door. The storm hit with shocking speed. Rain pelted the deck in heavy sheets while waves grew steadily higher. Simon fought with the wheel, trying to maintain their heading as thunder cracked overhead. "Get inside!" he shouted to Leah. "Put Eli's life vest on." She nodded, clutching their son tightly as she made her way into the cabin. Simon could hear Eli's frightened wails even over the howling wind. A massive wave crashed over the port side, sending spray across the deck. Simon wiped salt water from his eyes, straining to see through the deluge. The coastline was barely visible through the gray curtain of rain. The next wave hit from starboard, and Simon's heart stopped as he heard Leah scream. He turned in time to see her stumble out of the cabin, Eli pressed protectively to her chest. Both wore life vests, but Leah's face was pale with fear. "Water's coming in," she shouted. "The cabin's flooding." Before Simon could respond, a deafening crack split the air. The boat shuddered violently. They'd struck something. Rock or reef, it didn't matter. Water rushed across the deck as the yacht listed heavily to one side. "Leah!" Simon abandoned the wheel, lunging toward his wife and son. Another wave swept across the deck, and Leah lost her footing. Simon's fingers brushed the strap of her life vest before the water pulled them apart. The last thing he saw was Leah's arms wrapped tightly around Eli as they went overboard. Then something struck Simon's head, and darkness took him. Beeping machines pulled him back to consciousness. Simon's eyes fluttered open to stark white walls and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Every breath sent pain shooting through his ribs. A figure stood at the foot of his hospital bed, a detective based on the badge clipped to his belt. The man's grim expression made Simon's blood run cold. "Mr. Alden," the detective said softly, "I'm Detective Morris. I need to speak with you about the accident." Simon tried to sit up, ignoring the pain. "My wife, my son, I'm so sorry, Mr. Alden." The detective's voice was heavy with sympathy. "We found your wife's body this morning about 2 miles down the coast." The words hit Simon like physical blows. He shook his head, denial rising like bile in his throat. "No, you're wrong. And Eli? Where's my son?" Detective Morris looked down at his notepad. "We're still searching, but all we've found so far is a torn infant life vest and a baby blanket that washed up on shore." Simon's world crumbled. A ragged sound tore from his throat, part scream, part sob. He barely registered the nurse rushing in, barely felt the sting of a needle in his arm. Hours later, though it felt like years, Simon stood in the hospital morgue. His legs shook as he approached the covered form on the metal table. The medical examiner pulled back the sheet with practiced gentleness, revealing Leah's face. She looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, but her skin was too pale, too cold. Simon's knees gave out. He would have collapsed if the detective hadn't caught his arm. "Wait," Simon choked out. "There's something in my personal effects. From the boat." The nurse brought his belongings, and Simon's trembling fingers found what he sought. The small, painted whale rock somehow survived the wreck. He clutched it to his chest as tears streamed down his face, remembering Leah's words, "A guardian for our little sailor." But their little sailor was gone, along with the woman he loved, leaving Simon alone with nothing but a painted rock and an ocean of grief. The black iron gates of Simon's coastal mansion creaked open, and his car crawled up the winding driveway. Camera flashes exploded around him like lightning, reporters pressing against the fence with microphones extended. Their shouted questions blurred together into meaningless noise. "Mr. Alden, any comment on the Coast Guard ending the search? Do you believe your son could still be alive? Will there be a memorial service?" Simon kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually clean-shaven face bore several days' worth of stubble. He hadn't bothered to maintain his appearance since leaving the hospital. The garage door hummed closed behind him, shutting out the circus of media vultures. Simon sat in the silent car for several long minutes, his hands still gripping the wheel. The house loomed before him, massive and empty. Walking in alone felt impossible. Finally, he forced himself to move. His footsteps echoed through the foyer, everything exactly as they'd left it that morning weeks ago. Leah's gardening magazine still lay open on the kitchen counter. Her coffee mug sat in the dish rack, lipstick stain on the rim. Simon's chest tightened. He grabbed the counter's edge, trying to steady his breathing. His gaze fell on the refrigerator, covered in photos held by colorful magnets. Leah and him on their wedding day. Eli's first smile. The three of them at the beach last summer, Leah's hair wild in the wind, baby Eli bundled against her chest. He turned away sharply, but there was no escape from the memories. They filled every corner of the house. The blanket Leah's mother had knitted draped over the couch, the stack of parenting books on the coffee table, the basket of Eli's toys beside the TV. His feet carried him upstairs without conscious thought. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, exactly as they'd left it. Simon's hand trembled as he pushed it open. Afternoon sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains, illuminating the peaceful room. The walls were painted a soft seafoam green, decorated with whimsical ocean creatures Leah had stenciled herself. A bookshelf held dozens of picture books carefully arranged. The changing table still had fresh diapers stacked neatly in their basket. And there was the crib, its white paint gleaming. The mobile above it, delicate glass whales and ships, hung crookedly, one of the strings broken. As Simon watched, a breeze from the partially open window made it swing slightly, casting dancing shadows on the wall. The empty crib broke something in Simon's chest. He stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. His breaths came in harsh gasps as he slid down the wall, head in his hands. Days blurred together. Simon ignored calls from family and friends. Food delivered by well-meaning neighbors rotted in the refrigerator. He moved through the house like a ghost, unable to sleep in the master bedroom where Leah's perfume still lingered on her pillow. 2 weeks after returning home, he sat in a sterile conference room at the police station. Detective Morris spread photos across the table, pieces of wreckage, the torn life vest, Eli's sodden blanket. "I'm sorry, Mr. Alden, but we have to be realistic," the detective said gently. "Given the storm conditions, the water temperature, without recovering a body, we're officially listing your son as presumed deceased." "No." Simon's voice was hoarse from disuse. "You can't just stop looking. We've had boats and helicopters searching for weeks. Every piece of debris has been documented. Sometimes we have to accept that the sea doesn't give up its dead." Simon surged to his feet, sending his chair clattering backward. "He's not dead. I would know. A father would know." "Mr. Alden, please, my son is out there somewhere." Simon's fist slammed the table. "I won't let you write him off like a lost piece of cargo." The detective's face was heavy with sympathy. "The funeral home that handled your wife's service has experience with these situations. They can help you plan a memorial." "Get out." Simon's voice shook with rage. "No funeral, no memorial, not until I know." He stormed from the building, ignoring the detective calling after him. In his car, his hands shook so badly he could barely grip the keys. Simon tried to return to work the following week. His architecture firm had been understanding about his absence, holding his projects for him. But sitting at his drafting table, all he could see were the designs for the nursery renovation he'd planned. The built-in bookshelf that would never be filled, the window seat where Leah would never rock their son. Panic clawed at his throat. The lines on the paper blurred, his chest constricted until he couldn't breathe. A concerned colleague found him hyperventilating in the bathroom, and his partners gently suggested he take an indefinite leave of absence. That night, Simon stood on the private dock behind his house, staring out at the dark water. The moon cast a silver path across the gentle waves, so different from the roiling monster that had stolen his family. A cool breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed. He pulled the painted whale rock from his pocket, running his thumb over its smooth surface. The cheerful blues and grays seemed to mock him now. What kind of guardian had it been? Where was their little sailor? Simon placed the rock carefully on the dock's wooden railing. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "If you're out there, come home." The words disappeared into the night, swallowed by the sound of waves lapping against the pilings. Simon stood there until his legs ached, as if waiting for an answer that would never come. Finally, he turned and walked back to the empty house, leaving the painted whale to stand sentinel over the dark waters below. 5 years carved deep lines into Simon Alden's face. At 43, his dark hair had begun graying at the temples, and his once sharp business attire had given way to worn jeans and faded work shirts. The coastal mansion that had once hosted elegant dinner parties now stood silent, its rooms spotless but devoid of life. In his converted studio, half-finished architectural models gathered dust. Complex designs for museums, libraries, and cultural centers, projects he'd once attacked with passion, remained frozen in various stages of completion. The precision tools he'd once wielded with confidence lay untouched, replaced by rougher implements, sandpaper, wood files, boat varnish. The workshop behind the house had become his sanctuary. Here, Simon spent his days restoring old boats, losing himself in the methodical work of sanding, sealing, and refinishing. The vessel's sleek hulls gleamed with fresh paint and polished brass, but none ever touched the water. They sat in perfect, sterile rows like museum pieces, beautiful but untouchable. Morning light filtered through the workshop's windows as Simon moved through his carefully structured routine. He measured coffee grounds with scientific precision, the same amount every day. Breakfast was simple: plain toast, black coffee, eaten while standing at the kitchen counter. He avoided the dining room table, still set for 3. The local papers had long since stopped trying to contact him. The tragic story of the wealthy architect who lost his family at sea had faded from public memory. Simon had rejected every request: interviews about marine safety, invitations to speak at drowning prevention events, proposals to establish foundations in Leah and Eli's names. Each letter and phone call had been met with the same resolute silence. His house had become a carefully preserved time capsule. Leah's art supplies remained arranged on her studio desk, brushes clean and waiting. Family photos still lined the walls, though Simon never looked at them directly. The second floor's east wing remained locked, the nursery door untouched since that first day home. As afternoon crept toward evening, dark clouds began gathering over the coast. Simon watched their approach from his workshop window, his hands automatically moving over a wooden gunnel with sandpaper. The weather report had warned of a significant storm system moving in, the kind that once would have sent him rushing home to secure loose items and comfort his storm-anxious wife. Now he simply observed as the wind picked up, bending the trees and sending leaves skittering across the driveway. The first heavy drops began falling as he packed away his tools with mechanical precision. By the time he walked back to the main house, the storm had arrived in full force. Thunder rolled across the sky as Simon moved through his evening routine. Dinner was a microwaved meal eaten in the kitchen. He washed the single plate and fork immediately, returning them to their designated spots. The house creaked and groaned around him as the wind intensified. At precisely 8 o'clock, the power flickered and died. Simon stood motionless in the darkness for several moments before retrieving an old brass lantern from a kitchen drawer. The warm glow created shifting shadows on the walls as he carried it to his study. The leather armchair creaked as he settled into it, setting a glass of whiskey on the side table. From the bottom drawer of his desk, he removed a wooden box he hadn't opened in months. The brass key was cold in his hand as he turned it in the lock. Inside lay a collection of letters, their edges softened with handling. Leah's flowing handwriting filled each page, notes she'd left in his briefcase during their courtship. Long letters from her summer studying art in Paris, simple love notes tucked into his lunch. Simon's fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the first one. "My brilliant architect," it began. "You spend your days building walls, but you've let me see what's behind them. Don't forget to leave room for wonder in those perfect plans of yours." The storm raged outside as Simon read by lantern light, each letter carrying echoes of Leah's voice. The whiskey remained untouched, amber liquid reflecting the flame's glow. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the house to its foundations. Then, barely audible above the storm, came a sound that didn't belong, knocking at the front door. Simon froze, the letter dropping from his suddenly numb fingers. The knock came again, more insistent. No one visited him. His groceries were delivered to the garage. His mail went to a P.O. box. The security gate was always locked. The knocking continued, desperate now. Simon rose slowly, his heart pounding. He lifted the lantern, its light barely penetrating the darkness of the foyer as he approached the door. Another thunderclap rattled the windows. His hand hesitated on the door handle. The knocking had stopped. For a moment he thought whoever it was had gone. Then he heard it, a small sound, like a whimper. Simon pulled the door open, holding the lantern high. Rain whipped in sideways, instantly soaking his clothes. At first he saw nothing but darkness and sheets of water. Then the lantern light fell on a small figure on his doorstep. A boy stood there, perhaps 5 years old, completely drenched. His feet were bare and caked with mud. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his clothes, too big for him, were filthy and torn. The child stared up at Simon with wide, solemn eyes. But it was what the boy clutched in his small hand that made Simon's world tilt sideways. There, its cheerful blues and grays dulled by dirt but still unmistakable, was the painted whale rock. Simon's hands trembled as he reached for the boy, gently pulling him out of the storm and into the foyer. Water dripped from the child's clothes, forming dark puddles on the hardwood floor. Without thinking, Simon rushed to the nearby linen closet and grabbed his softest blanket, the one Leah had always insisted on keeping there, just in case. "Here," Simon said softly, wrapping it around the boy's shivering shoulders. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the child. The lantern's glow cast warm light across the boy's face, highlighting features that made Simon's chest tighten, the curve of his nose, the set of his jaw. The whale rock remained clutched tightly in the boy's small fist, his knuckles white with the effort of holding on. Simon's eyes kept darting to it, his mind refusing to process how this could be possible. That rock had been in his desk drawer for 5 years, hadn't it? He'd just seen it there yesterday. "Can you tell me your name?" Simon asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy's eyes, dark and serious, stayed fixed on Simon's face, but no words came. "Where are your parents? Where did you come from?" Still nothing. Just that unwavering stare, as if the child was trying to communicate something beyond words. Simon noticed the boy was shaking, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "Let's get you warm," Simon said, leading the child toward the living room. The boy followed without resistance, his bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. Simon guided him to the large leather armchair near the fireplace, Leah's favorite spot, and adjusted the blanket more securely around him. With trembling fingers, Simon pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. The dispatcher's voice came through clearly despite the storm raging outside. 911, what's your emergency?" "Yes, Simon's voice caught. He cleared his throat. "I need to report a lost child. He just showed up at my door. Maybe 5 years old. He's not speaking and he's alone." "What's your location, sir?" 2487 Ocean Vista Drive, the Alden residence." Simon paused, then added, "Please hurry." "We're dispatching units now, Mr. Alden. Please stay with the child. Is he injured?" Simon studied the boy, who had drawn his knees up to his chest but remained alert, watching Simon's every move. "I don't think so. Just cold and wet. Maybe scared." "Help is on the way. Try to keep him calm and warm until they arrive." After hanging up, Simon went to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and some crackers. The boy accepted the water, drinking deeply, but ignored the food. The whale rock never left his grip. As they waited, Simon noticed something that made his skin prickle. The boy's eyes kept drifting around the room, lingering on certain things: the large seascape painting Leah had done of the coastline, the family photos on the mantel, the shelf of nautical books in the corner. There was recognition in those glances, a familiarity that shouldn't be possible. The minutes stretched on, marked by thunder and the steady drum of rain. Simon found himself studying the boy's features more intently. The shape of his ears, the slight dimple in his chin, the way his eyebrows drew together in concentration, all of it tugged at something deep in Simon's memory. Finally, red and blue lights began flashing through the windows. Car doors slammed outside. Simon rose to answer the knock at the door, finding 2 police officers, a pair of paramedics, and a woman who introduced herself as Andrea Walsh from Child Protective Services. "The boy's in here," Simon said, leading them to the living room. The child's eyes widened at the sight of the uniformed strangers, and he pressed himself deeper into the chair. One paramedic approached slowly, speaking in gentle tones as she checked the boy for injuries. The social worker knelt beside her, asking the same questions Simon had tried earlier, receiving the same silence in response. "Any identification on him?" one of the officers asked, notebook in hand. Simon shook his head. "Nothing. Just showed up like this, but..." He hesitated, then pressed on. "I think you should run a DNA test. There's something... I can't explain it, but..." "Sir," the officer cut him off. "He's probably just a runaway. We'll check missing persons reports. Try to locate his family." "You don't understand," Simon insisted, his voice rising. "That rock he's holding..." He turned toward the mantel where he'd placed his own whale rock years ago, intending to show them the impossible duplicate, but the rock wasn't there. Simon's breath caught as he spun back toward the boy. There, still gripped tightly in the child's small hand, was the only whale rock in the room. The same blues and grays, the same childish brushstrokes, the same tiny chip on one side where it had knocked against Eli's crib. "No," Simon whispered, his world tilting on its axis. "It can't be." The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room cast a harsh glow over Simon's exhausted face as he sat hunched over a paper cup of bitter coffee. The night's events felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't quite shake. Every few minutes his eyes drifted to the closed door where they'd taken the boy for evaluation. The social worker, who had introduced herself as Dana Matthews, sat across from him. She had kind eyes and an air of quiet competence that somehow made the situation feel less overwhelming. She'd been the one to suggest Simon could stay, though a uniformed officer remained stationed nearby. "Mr. Alden," Dana said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "I know this is difficult, but can you tell me more about why you believe this child might be connected to you?" Simon's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. The rock he was holding, "I painted it with my wife, for our son's nursery." His voice cracked slightly. 5 years ago. Dana leaned forward, her expression careful but engaged. "And you're certain it's the same one?" "It has the exact same chip on the side, the same colors we used." Simon ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Look, I know how this sounds, but that rock was in my desk drawer yesterday, and now this boy shows up with it." "I understand your concern," Dana said, making a note in her file. "But we need to focus on the child's immediate well-being first. The doctors are checking him for any signs of trauma or neglect." Simon nodded, though his mind was racing. After another hour of tense waiting, a pediatrician emerged to report that the boy appeared physically healthy, if somewhat undernourished. No signs of abuse, just a persistent silence that suggested emotional trauma. "I want a DNA test," Simon said suddenly, standing up. "Please, I need to know." The pediatrician exchanged glances with Dana. "Mr. Alden, given that we have no identification for the child and your concerns, we could arrange that, but it would take around 72 hours for results." "I'll wait," Simon said firmly. "Whatever it takes." After some discussion and paperwork, the test was approved. A nurse came to take samples from both Simon and the boy. Throughout the procedure, the child remained stoic, his dark eyes following everyone's movements with that same unsettling intensity. Dana spent the morning trying different approaches to communicate with him. She brought in paper and crayons, setting them on a small table in the children's ward where they'd moved him. "Sometimes drawing helps children express what they're feeling," she explained to Simon, who watched from a chair by the door. At first, the boy just held the crayon, staring at the blank paper. Then, slowly, he began to draw. Simple lines emerged. A house perched on what looked like a hill, rectangular windows neat and evenly spaced. Below it, he added a red truck. Finally, he drew 2 stick figures, one tall, one very small. Simon leaned forward, his heart pounding. The house on the hill. Something about it seemed familiar. Dana noticed his reaction and carefully slid the drawing closer to him. "Does this mean something to you?" she asked quietly. Simon's throat felt tight. "The view from my property, there's a hill like that, and I used to drive a red pickup before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Dana studied him thoughtfully. Children often draw what they know, what feels safe to them, but we need to be careful about making assumptions. The days stretched on with more tests, more questions, more waiting. Finally, as evening approached, Dana informed Simon that the boy would be staying in the children's ward overnight for observation. "We'll need to place him in temporary care while we investigate and wait for the DNA results." Simon nodded numbly, gathering his coat. The weight of possibility, of hope and fear tangled together, felt almost unbearable. He drove home in a daze, the hospital's antiseptic smell still clinging to his clothes. Inside his empty house, sleep felt impossible. Simon paced the halls until he found himself standing before a door he hadn't opened in 5 years. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob of the nursery. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of stale air. Moonlight filtered through dusty curtains, illuminating the room like a photograph frozen in time. The mobile above the crib hung motionless, its shadows dancing across the walls. Everything was exactly as he'd left it that last morning. The changing table still stocked with diapers, tiny clothes still folded in the dresser. Simon moved through the room like a man in a trance, his fingers trailing over familiar surfaces. When he reached the crib, something compelled him to lift the mattress. There, tucked underneath, was a photograph he'd forgotten about. Leah sat in the rocking chair, infant Eli bundled in her arms. The painted whale rock sat on the windowsill beside them, catching the morning light. With shaking hands, Simon carried the photo downstairs to his office. He'd asked Dana for a copy of the boy's drawing, which now lay on his desk. Placing them side by side, he studied them in the lamp's glow. The hill in the child's drawing matched the slope behind his house perfectly. The same gentle curve, the same perspective from the road below. The stick figures drew his attention again. A man and a baby. Simon stared at them until his vision blurred, memories washing over him. Carrying infant Eli around the property, pointing out boats in the harbor, Leah laughing as she took photos of them. "Is that me?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air as the night deepened, but Simon didn't move. He sat there until dawn, looking between the photograph and the drawing, trying to bridge an impossible 5-year gap with nothing but hope and a painted rock. Over the next 3 days, Simon fell into a new routine. He'd arrive at the hospital as early as visiting hours allowed, carrying a small bag of carefully chosen items he thought might help. The sterile hospital room had been made more child-friendly with colorful blankets and a few stuffed animals provided by the pediatric ward, but it still felt temporary, uncertain. The boy, Simon couldn't quite bring himself to call him Eli yet, despite the hope burning in his chest, showed small but significant changes. On the first morning, he actually accepted a plate of pancakes, eating slowly but steadily while Dana observed. His eyes would follow Simon around the room, watchful but no longer fearful. "He's making progress," Dana told Simon quietly as they watched the child draw another picture. "He's responding to yes or no questions with head movements, which shows he understands and wants to communicate. That's important." Simon nodded, noting how the boy's shoulders had relaxed slightly since that first night. "But why won't he speak?" "Selective mutism is common in traumatized children," Dana explained, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "It's often a survival mechanism. The fact that he's not showing signs of physical abuse is actually remarkable given the circumstances. Whatever happened to him, someone was caring for him, even if in isolation." The thought made Simon's head spin. Who could have had his son all these years? How had he survived? The questions plagued him, but he forced himself to focus on the present moment, on building trust with this silent, watchful child. On the second day, Simon brought the music box from the nursery. It was a delicate wooden thing, hand-carved with sailing ships and whales. He'd wound it up that morning, praying it still worked after all these years. "I thought you might like this," he said softly, placing it on the bedside table. The boy looked up from his drawing, curious but cautious. Simon opened the lid. The familiar melody of "You Are My Sunshine" filled the room, slightly tinny but unmistakable. The boy's crayon stopped moving. His eyes grew wide, fixed on the slowly turning mechanism. Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps even memory. Dana, who had been quietly observing from her chair, leaned forward. "Do you know this song?" she asked. The boy gave a small, quick nod. His hand reached out, hovering over the music box but not quite touching it. Simon's heart clenched. Leah had played this every night, singing along as she rocked their baby to sleep. "It's yours," Simon said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's always been yours." The next morning, Simon arrived with a photo album tucked under his arm. He'd spent half the night going through boxes in his attic, finding the least painful memories to share. Dana helped him set up at the small table where the boy liked to draw. "Would you like to look at some pictures?" she asked, and the boy nodded, setting aside his crayons. Simon opened the album carefully. The first few pages showed his house being built, then the garden Leah had planted. The boy studied each photo intently, his small finger sometimes tracing the outline of the house or the shape of the trees. Then they turned to a page with baby pictures. Simon held his breath as the boy's eyes locked onto a particular photo. Eli, at about 6 months old, sitting in his high chair, face covered in birthday cake frosting. Leah's hand was visible at the edge of the frame, wiping his cheek with a napkin. The boy's reaction was immediate and startling. He jabbed his finger at the baby in the photo, then pointed to himself. His eyes met Simon's, urgent and insistent. The message was clear. "That's me." Simon had to stand up and walk to the window, his legs shaking. Behind him, he heard Dana speaking softly to the boy, asking him to show her more pictures he recognized. Each time, the child's responses grew more animated, more certain. Later that afternoon, Dana pulled Simon aside while a nurse was helping the boy with his lunch. Her expression was thoughtful, professional, but Simon could see the emotion she was trying to contain. "Mr. Alden," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something. In my experience, children this age can be suggestible. They sometimes create stories or adopt memories that aren't their own. But this is different." She glanced at the boy, then back to Simon. "If this isn't your son, he truly believes he is. His reactions to these items, these photos, they're genuine. He's not playing pretend." Simon pressed his palms against his eyes, fighting back tears. "The DNA test?" "Should be back tomorrow," Dana finished. "Whatever the results, we'll handle it together." The third day felt endless. Simon brought more photos, more small treasures from home, but his mind kept drifting to the test results. The boy seemed to sense his distraction, growing quieter than usual, though he kept the music box close. It was nearly midnight when Simon's phone rang. He'd been sitting in his dark kitchen, staring at the ocean through his window, unable to sleep. The hospital number made his hands shake so badly he almost dropped the phone. "Mr. Alden?" It was Dr. Martinez, the pediatrician. "We have the DNA results." Simon couldn't speak. His free hand gripped the kitchen counter. "The test shows a 99.98% match. He's your son, Mr. Alden. The boy is Eli." The phone slipped from Simon's grasp, clattering on the counter. His legs gave out, and he sank to the kitchen floor, pressing his forehead against the cool cabinet door. No sound came out when he opened his mouth. 5 years of grief, of guilt, of empty rooms and silence. It all crashed over him in waves. He had no memory of getting up, of finding his keys, of getting into his car. The world was a blur of streetlights and fog as he drove toward the hospital in the pre-dawn darkness. Tears streamed down his face, but he barely noticed them. All he could think was, my son is alive, my son came home." The coastal fog grew thicker as he approached the hospital, wrapping the world in gray. But for the first time in 5 years, Simon felt like he could finally see clearly. The hospital corridors were quiet in the early morning hours as Simon followed a nurse through the pediatric wing. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors, each step bringing him closer to a reality he still couldn't fully grasp. The nurse led him to a small observation room with large windows and child-sized furniture scattered about. Through the glass, Simon could see Eli sitting at a low table, concentrated on painting with watercolors. The boy's dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned over his work, his small hands careful and deliberate with each brushstroke. He looked so much like Leah in that moment that Simon's breath caught in his throat. Dana was already there, standing near the door. She greeted Simon with a warm smile, noting the redness around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. "I heard about the results," she said softly. "How are you holding up?" Simon shook his head, unable to find words. His eyes remained fixed on Eli through the window. "He's been painting all morning," Dana continued. "He seems calmer today." She touched Simon's arm gently. "Would you like a moment alone with him?" Simon nodded, his throat tight. Dana opened the door quietly, then stepped back. "I'll be right outside if you need me." The room smelled of paint and paper and children's soap. Eli didn't look up as Simon entered, still focused on his artwork. Watercolor clouds of blue and green spread across his paper, forming what might have been ocean waves. Simon's legs felt unsteady as he approached the small table. He pulled out one of the tiny chairs and lowered himself down, careful not to startle the boy. With trembling hands, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the painted whale rock. He placed it gently on the table, just at the edge of Eli's paper. The soft brush in Eli's hand stilled. His eyes fixed on the rock, then slowly lifted to Simon's face. The intensity of his gaze made Simon's heart ache. There was so much understanding there, so much careful observation. Simon took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Your name," he said softly, "is Eli." He paused, watching the boy's face. "I'm your father." The words hung in the air between them. Eli's brush slipped from his fingers, leaving a small blue puddle on his painting. His eyes darted between Simon's face and the whale rock, as if connecting pieces of a puzzle only he could see. Slowly, so slowly, Eli's small hand crept across the table. His fingers brushed against the painted rock, tracing its familiar patterns. Then, hesitantly, they moved toward Simon's hand where it rested on the table. Simon held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Eli's fingertips touched his knuckles, light as butterfly wings. Then, in a movement that seemed to surprise them both, Eli pushed himself up from his chair and stepped forward. The hug came without warning. Eli's arms wrapped around Simon's neck, tight and desperate, like he was holding on to something he feared might disappear. His small body trembled slightly, face pressed into Simon's shoulder. No words, no sound at all. Just the fierce, silent embrace of a child who had finally found his way home. Simon's arms came up automatically, cradling his son. Tears fell freely now, soaking into Eli's shirt. 5 years of emptiness, of wondering, of guilt and grief. All of it crystallized in this moment of recognition. His son was alive. His son was here. His son knew him. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, but must have been only minutes. Eventually, Eli's grip loosened slightly, though he didn't pull away completely. Simon rubbed small circles on his back, the way he used to when Eli was a baby. A soft knock at the door announced Dana's return. She entered quietly, carrying a folder of papers. Her eyes were suspiciously bright as she watched them, but her voice remained professional. "Mr. Alden," she said gently, "we have some paperwork to go through." Simon nodded but didn't let go of Eli. The boy had shifted to sit in his lap now, one hand still gripping Simon's shirt. Dana pulled up a chair beside them and opened her folder. "These are temporary custody papers," she explained, spreading several documents on the table. "Given the DNA confirmation and the circumstances, the court has granted immediate provisional custody to you as Eli's biological father. However," she emphasized this point carefully, "there will need to be a formal review process. We'll need to establish proper support systems, schedule regular check-ins, and ensure everything is in place for Eli's continued well-being." Simon listened carefully as Dana outlined the requirements: home visits, pediatric appointments, child psychologist consultations. His hand never stopped its gentle motion on Eli's back. "Whatever he needs," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Dana smiled, then handed him a pen. "Sign here and here," she indicated several spots on the papers. "This grants you temporary legal custody, effective immediately." Simon's signature was shaky but determined on each line. Eli watched the pen move across the paper, his head resting against Simon's chest. When the last form was signed, Dana gathered them efficiently. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "You can take him home now." The word home seemed to resonate through the room. Eli lifted his head, looking at Simon with a question in his eyes. "Would you like that?" Simon asked softly. "Would you like to go home?" Eli nodded, his first clear response of the morning. He slid off Simon's lap and carefully picked up the whale rock from the table, clutching it close. Dana helped them gather Eli's few belongings: the drawings, a small bag of clothes the hospital had provided, the music box Simon had brought. She walked them through the quiet hallways to the hospital exit, where Simon's car waited in the early morning light. Simon opened the back door where a booster seat had already been installed by the hospital staff. Eli studied it for a moment, then allowed Simon to help him in, watching intently as the buckles were fastened. "We'll be in touch soon to schedule the first home visit," Dana said through the window. "Take care of each other." Simon nodded gratefully, then walked around to the driver's side. As he adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes met Eli's in the reflection. The boy was looking back at him, still silent, but somehow more present than he'd been since arriving at Simon's door. Between them on the center console, the whale rock sat like a bridge between past and present, a small, painted reminder of all that had been lost and, miraculously, found again. Simon started the car, and together they drove away from the hospital toward home. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's windows as Simon carried Eli through the front doors. The boy's weight in his arms felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Eli's head swiveled slowly, taking in the high ceilings, the carefully maintained furniture, and the wall of photographs that lined the entrance hall. Simon watched his son's face carefully, noting every subtle reaction. Eli's eyes moved with purpose, not the random curiosity of a child in a new place, but with the careful attention of someone trying to confirm memories. When his gaze tracked up the grand staircase toward the second floor, toward the nursery hallway, Simon felt his heart skip. "Are you hungry?" Simon asked softly, trying to keep his voice steady. Eli nodded against his shoulder, though his eyes remained fixed on the upper landing. The kitchen felt different with a child in it. Simon had kept it spotless over the years, but unused, a showroom rather than a living space. Now, with Eli perched on a counter stool, small feet swinging, it felt like it was waking up from a long sleep. Simon moved through the familiar motions of preparing oatmeal, adding a drizzle of honey the way Leah used to. He couldn't help glancing at Eli every few seconds, still afraid the boy might vanish like morning mist. The old radio on the windowsill had gathered dust, but Simon switched it on, letting soft classical music fill the silence. The melody was gentle. Debussy, he thought. As he stirred the oatmeal, a sound made him freeze. Eli was humming, barely audible, but perfectly in tune with the music. Simon's hand gripped the wooden spoon tightly. That specific melody, those exact notes, Leah used to hum them while rocking baby Eli to sleep. It had been their special lullaby. Simon's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, focusing on serving the oatmeal into a bowl. When he turned back, Eli was watching him with those knowing eyes, as if he understood exactly what had caused his father's reaction. After breakfast, they began exploring the house together. Simon let Eli set the pace, following as the boy moved from room to room. In Simon's study, Eli paused to examine the architectural models, his small fingers hovering over miniature buildings and tiny trees. In the living room, he touched the piano keys gently, producing soft, random notes. Each room seemed to come alive as Eli moved through it. Colors appeared brighter, shadows less deep. Simon realized he'd been living in a mausoleum of memories, but Eli's presence was breathing life back into every corner. They climbed the stairs slowly, Eli's hand trailing along the banister. Family photos lined the wall, happier times, when they were 3 instead of 2. Eli stopped at each one, studying them intently. At the top of the stairs, he turned without hesitation toward the nursery hallway. The sealed door stood like a barrier between past and present. Simon had avoided this part of the house for 5 years, preserving it like a time capsule of grief. But Eli walked straight to it, placing his palm flat against the wood. He looked back at Simon, questioning. Simon's throat felt tight. "Do you—" He had to clear his throat to continue. "Do you want to see your room?" Eli nodded, stepping back to let Simon unlock the door. The hinges creaked slightly as it swung open, releasing the scent of dust and forgotten memories. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny stars. Everything was exactly as it had been that last morning. The nautical-themed mobile hanging still above the crib, the changing table with neatly folded blankets, the rocking chair where Leah had spent countless nights nursing their son. Books lined the shelves, stuffed animals sat patiently waiting, and colorful paintings of sea creatures decorated the walls. Eli stepped inside without hesitation, His fingers brushed the crib rail as he passed, leaving small tracks in the dust. Then, with the same purposeful movement he'd shown since arriving at the mansion, he walked directly to a shelf and reached for a specific toy, a small stuffed whale that baby Eli had never slept without. Simon's knees felt weak. There was no way to explain this. No way the boy could have known which toy had been his favorite, which shelf it sat on. Yet Eli held it now with the familiarity of an old friend, running his fingers over the worn fabric. Moving to the center of the room, Eli sat cross-legged on the faded nursery rug. From his pocket, he pulled out the small notepad and pencil Dana had given him at the hospital. With the stuffed whale tucked in his lap, he began to draw. Simon stood in the doorway watching his son. Sunlight caught Eli's dark hair, highlighting the same auburn tints that Leah's had held. His small face held the same focused expression she'd worn while painting. Brow slightly furrowed, lower lip caught between his teeth. The house seemed to exhale around them, as if it too had been holding its breath for 5 years. The dust motes continued their dance in the sunbeams, but now they looked less like signs of abandonment and more like tiny celebrations. Each creak of the old floorboards, each whisper of wind through the curtains, seemed to welcome Eli home. Simon's hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe, overwhelmed by the sight before him. This room, which had been a shrine to his grief, was transforming before his eyes. With each careful pencil stroke, each quiet breath from his son, life was flowing back into its corners, washing away the heavy silence of loss. For the first time since the accident, the mansion felt like a home again, not just a structure of wood and stone and memories, but a living space where love could grow, where healing could begin. In the center of it all sat Eli, drawing quietly, the stuffed whale and painted rock beside him, bridges between what was lost and what had been miraculously found. The evening settled over the mansion like a gentle blanket, bringing with it the soft, purple-orange glow of sunset through the windows. Simon stood in the master bathroom, testing the bathwater's temperature with his wrist the way he remembered Leah doing when Eli was an infant. Steam rose in delicate wisps, fogging the mirror. "Not too hot," he murmured to himself, adjusting the faucet. The sound of running water echoed off the tiles, filling the quiet house with its steady rhythm. Eli sat on the closed toilet lid, still holding the stuffed whale from the nursery. His eyes tracked Simon's every movement, studying his father's face with an intensity that made Simon's chest tighten. There was recognition in that gaze, but also uncertainty, as if Eli was comparing the man before him to some distant memory, trying to reconcile the two images. "Bath time," Simon said softly, keeping his voice gentle and even. He reached for Eli's dirty shirt, pausing to let the boy process the request. "Is that okay?" Eli nodded, setting the whale carefully on the counter. His movements were cautious but cooperative as Simon helped him out of the grimy clothes he'd arrived in. The boy's skin was marked with small scratches and bruises. Nothing serious, but each mark made Simon wonder about the years he'd missed, about where his son had been. The water welcomed Eli with a small splash as Simon helped him in. Unlike most 5-year-olds, who might play or splash, Eli sat perfectly still, watching the ripples spread across the surface. Simon picked up a washcloth, dipped it in the warm water, and began to gently clean away the dirt from Eli's arms and face. "I used to give you baths when you were very small," Simon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You loved the water, just like your mother." He swallowed hard against the memory of Leah laughing as baby Eli splashed in his infant tub. Eli's eyes fixed on Simon's face at the mention of his mother, but he remained silent. His small hand reached out and touched Simon's wrist, right where a thin scar marked the skin, a reminder of the accident. The touch was deliberate, knowing. Simon's hands trembled slightly as he continued washing his son's hair, working through the tangles as carefully as possible. When the bath was done, Simon wrapped Eli in a thick towel, lifting him out of the tub. Water dripped onto the tile floor, creating small puddles that reflected the bathroom light. Simon found himself automatically humming the same lullaby from earlier as he dried Eli's hair, the melody coming back to him like muscle memory. In the nursery, Simon pulled out a box of carefully preserved baby clothes. Most were too small now, but near the bottom, he found what he was looking for: a soft blue shirt that had been too big for baby Eli. Now, 5 years later, it fit perfectly. The sight of his son wearing it made Simon's vision blur momentarily. Eli touched the fabric with careful fingers, then looked up at Simon with those knowing eyes. He pointed to a small embroidered whale on the shirt's collar, another of Leah's touches. She had sewn it there herself, matching the theme of their nautical nursery. "Your mother made that," Simon explained, his voice rough with emotion. "She loved whales. That's why we painted the rock together, the one you brought back to us." The whale rock sat on the nursery dresser, its painted surface catching the last rays of sunset through the window. Eli walked over and picked it up, holding it close to his chest as he had since arriving. Simon watched as his son's fingers traced the familiar patterns: the blue waves, the white spray, the gray body of the whale breaching the surface. "Time for bed?" Simon asked, though he wasn't sure where Eli should sleep. The crib was far too small now, and he hadn't prepared a proper bedroom yet. Eli solved the problem by sitting on the floor near the window, still clutching the rock. He looked expectantly at the bookshelf. Simon's heart clenched as he spotted the worn copy of Goodnight Moon, Leah's favorite bedtime story. He remembered her voice, the way she'd changed tones for different parts, how baby Eli would reach for the colorful pages. With slightly shaking hands, he pulled the book from the shelf. Settling down beside his son, Simon opened the book. The spine crackled slightly, releasing the scent of old pages and memories. "In the great green room," he began, his voice steadying as he read, "there was a telephone and a red balloon." Eli leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the familiar illustrations. Each page turn was like stepping back in time. The same pictures, the same words, but now with his son beside him instead of in his arms. The room grew darker as Simon read, until only the warm glow of the nursery lamp illuminated the pages. When the story ended, Eli didn't move away. Instead, he shifted closer, curling up against Simon's side. His small body radiated warmth through the blue shirt as Simon reached for a blanket from the rocking chair, draping it over them both. The whale rock remained tucked safely in Eli's arms, and the stuffed whale sat guard nearby. Simon's finger hovered over the lamp switch. "Ready for sleep?" he whispered. Eli nodded against his shoulder, his eyes already growing heavy. With a soft click, darkness fell over the nursery, broken only by strips of moonlight through the windows. In the quiet, Simon could hear the gentle sound of Eli's breathing, soft, steady, trusting. It was a sound he'd thought he'd never hear again, a sound that transformed the empty mansion into something else entirely. No longer a museum of loss, but a shelter for this miracle he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Leaning his head back against the wall, Simon whispered into the darkness, "You're safe. I promise." The words felt like a sacred vow, spoken to both his son and the memory of Leah. Eli's only response was to curl closer, his breathing already deepened with sleep. Dawn crept through the large windows of the mansion, painting the hallways in soft golden light. Eli stirred from his makeshift bed on the nursery floor, where he and Simon had fallen asleep. His small fingers still clutched the whale rock, but his eyes were now wide and alert, taking in the early morning shadows. Simon remained asleep, his breathing deep and even. Eli carefully stood, the blanket falling softly around his feet. He padded silently across the room, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of waves and seabirds calling through the windows. Following some inner compass, Eli made his way down the hallway until he reached a set of double doors left slightly ajar. Simon's art studio stretched before him, a large, airy room filled with morning light. Easels stood like silent sentinels, some holding half-finished architectural drawings, others bare and waiting. Paint supplies lined one wall in neat rows, organized by color and size, just as Simon kept everything in his life. Without hesitation, Eli walked to an empty canvas propped on a low easel. He reached for the nearby paints, selecting bright yellow and red with decisive movements. His small hands worked the caps off the tubes with surprising skill. Finding a brush, he began to paint. The sound of bristles against canvas filled the quiet room. Eli worked with intense focus, applying bold strokes of yellow across the white surface. Red followed, bleeding into the yellow at the edges. His movements were unhurried but purposeful, as if he were copying something from memory. Simon woke to find the nursery empty, his heart skipping a beat until he heard the subtle sounds coming from his studio. He followed them, pausing in the doorway to watch his son paint. The sight stopped him cold. Eli's posture, the way he held the brush, even the slight tilt of his head as he considered his work. It was also familiar. So much like Leah. Moving quietly so as not to disturb Eli's concentration, Simon picked up his own brush and canvas. He settled nearby, close enough to watch, but not so near as to crowd the boy. Together they painted in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger around them. Hours passed like water flowing downstream. Neither spoke. The only sounds were their brushes moving, the occasional clink of a brush being dipped in water, and their steady breathing. Eli's painting slowly took shape. A red door emerged from the colors, stark against a brown hill that rose up from the bottom of the canvas. A yellow truck appeared beside what looked like a small cabin, its details simple but clear. Simon watched the image develop with growing intensity. He reached for his notebook, always kept close for architectural inspirations, and began carefully copying Eli's painting. Every detail, every color choice, the particular angle of the hill, he documented it all with precise strokes of his pencil. The sun climbed higher, casting different shadows across their workspace. Still, they painted. Eli added more details. Tiny windows in the cabin, a path leading to the door, what might have been trees in the background. His small face remained focused, lost in the work, as if the painting itself was speaking through him. Simon noticed how naturally Eli handled the brushes, how he mixed colors with instinctive skill. Leah had been the same way, able to lose herself completely in her art, to let the colors speak their own truth. The similarity made Simon's chest ache with a mixture of joy and sadness. As afternoon light began to fade, Eli finally set down his brush. He studied his finished work with those serious eyes that seemed to hold so much behind them. Simon studied it too, wondering what the image meant, where it came from in his son's memory. Later that evening, after they had cleaned up the studio and eaten a quiet dinner, Simon made a decision. He led Eli down the hallway to his bedroom, a room he rarely entered anymore. On the wall hung a painting he hadn't looked at in years. Leah, captured in oils, her face bright with laughter as she stood on their beach, her hair caught by the wind. Simon knelt beside Eli, watching his son's face as the boy took in the painting. Eli stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Leah's face. His small hand reached out, not quite touching the canvas, hovering over the image of his mother's smile. The silence in the room grew deeper, heavier with meaning. Then Eli pointed at the painting, his finger steady and sure. His lips parted, and in a voice hoarse from disuse, he whispered a single word. "Mama." The sound seemed to hang in the air like a bell tone. Simon felt his knees give way, and he dropped to the floor beside his son. His arms went around Eli automatically, pulling him close, holding him as if he might disappear again. Tears spilled down his cheeks as that whispered word echoed in his mind. Mama. Proof that Eli remembered, that somewhere in his silence he had carried the memory of Leah all these years. Eli didn't pull away from the embrace. He kept his eyes on the painting, on Leah's face, as if completing some circuit between past and present, between the mother he had lost and the father who had found him again. That single word hung between them, a bridge across 5 years of silence, a key turning in a long-locked door. The morning sun filtered through Simon's kitchen windows as he spread Eli's painting across the granite counter. His fingers traced the careful brushstrokes, the red door, the brown hill, the yellow truck. Each detail felt like a piece of a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his recent contacts until he found Dana's number. His thumb hesitated for just a moment before pressing call. She answered on the third ring. Dana speaking. "It's Simon Alden. I need your help with something." His voice was steady, but urgent. "Eli painted a picture yesterday. I think it might be where he's been all these years." There was a brief pause on the line. "I can be there in 30 minutes. While waiting for Dana, Simon watched Eli in the garden through the kitchen window. The boy sat cross-legged on the grass, running his fingers through the morning dew, completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of feeling the wet blades between his fingers. Dana arrived exactly when she said she would, her practical shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. She carried her usual worn leather bag, but today there was an intensity in her step that matched Simon's urgency. "Show me," she said as soon as she entered. Simon led her to the kitchen counter where the painting lay. Dana studied it carefully, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. She pulled out her phone and took several photos from different angles. "The level of detail is remarkable," she said, zooming in on her screen. "The perspective, the specific features. This isn't just imagination. This is memory." Simon nodded, his throat tight. "That's what I thought too." Dana straightened up, her face thoughtful. "I know someone who might be able to help. A private investigator named Marcus Chen. He specializes in cases involving children living off the grid. He's helped us locate several families who've gone underground to avoid the system. Can you contact him?" Already typing the email. Dana's fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen. "He's good at finding patterns others miss. If this place exists, he'll find it." Within an hour, Marcus Chen arrived at the mansion. He was younger than Simon expected, dressed in casual clothes that helped him blend into any crowd. His eyes, though, were sharp and focused as he examined the painting. "The hill formation is distinctive," Marcus noted, pulling out a laptop. "And that red door, it's not just decorative. It's a specific style, probably from the 1960s or 70s. That helps narrow the time frame of construction." They gathered around the kitchen island as Marcus pulled up property records and satellite images. His fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing data points and land surveys. "We're looking for something that might not be officially recorded," he explained, "but everything leaves traces. Utility hookups, old property lines, access roads that appear on maps but lead nowhere official." Hours passed as they combed through records. Eli drifted in and out of the kitchen, sometimes watching them curiously, other times returning to his quiet play in the garden. Simon made sure he ate lunch, but his own food sat untouched as he studied map after map with Marcus. Late in the afternoon, Dana noticed something. "Wait, go back to that property record from 1975. Marcus scrolled back. There it was, a small parcel of land, originally owned by someone named Maeve Wren. The property had been officially abandoned in the early 1980s, but satellite images showed what might be a structure still standing. "The location matches the topography in Eli's painting," Marcus said, pulling up a terrain map. "It's on a cliff overlooking the coast, accessed by a private road that was never properly maintained." Simon studied the name on the record. Maeve Wren. Who was she? Marcus's fingers flew across the keyboard again. Former trauma nurse at County General, retired in 1982. No death certificate on file, but no recent records either. Dropped off the grid completely about 6 years ago. The timing made Simon's heart race. Right around when Eli disappeared, Dana finished softly. As evening approached, Simon made a decision. He bundled Eli into his car, making sure the boy had his whale rock and a warm jacket. The autumn air was growing cooler as they drove along the coastal road, following Marcus's carefully plotted directions. Eli sat quietly in his car seat, watching the scenery pass. Simon kept glancing in the rearview mirror, studying his son's face for any sign of recognition. The road narrowed as they turned onto a less maintained path, trees crowding close on either side. The sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows through the branches. Simon drove slowly, careful of the rough terrain. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as they rounded each bend, wondering if this would be the moment. Then it happened. As they approached a particular stretch of road, Eli's entire demeanor changed. His small body straightened in his seat, and his eyes widened with recognition. He pressed one hand against the window, leaning forward as far as his seatbelt would allow. And then, most remarkably, he began to hum. The same melody he'd hummed in the kitchen that first morning, the one that had stopped Simon in his tracks because it was Leah's tune. But now there was something different in it, something that spoke of memory and home and recognition. Simon slowed the car almost to a stop, watching as Eli's eyes tracked the passing landscape with absolute certainty. They were close. They had found it. Somewhere ahead, through these trees and around these bends, stood a red door that held the answers to 5 years of silence. The humming continued, soft but clear in the quiet car, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Eli's hand remained pressed against the window, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, leading them both toward the truth that waited at the end of this narrow coastal road. The morning fog clung to the coastal cliffs as Simon's car crawled up the narrow dirt road, Marcus Chen following close behind in his own vehicle. The investigator had insisted on accompanying Simon, citing safety concerns about abandoned properties. But Simon barely heard the precautions. His mind was fixed on the images from Eli's painting, on the possibility of answers that had eluded him for 5 years. They'd left Eli with Dana at the mansion. The boy had been reluctant to let go of Simon's hand, but eventually settled with his art supplies and the ever-present whale rock beside him. Simon promised to return quickly, though the words felt hollow. He had no idea what they would find here. The road curved sharply, and suddenly it was there, exactly as Eli had painted it. Simon's breath caught in his throat. The small house stood weathered, but defiant against the maritime winds, its wooden siding aged to a soft gray. The red door, though rusted and peeling, remained a beacon of color against the muted landscape. In the overgrown driveway sat an old yellow pickup truck, its once bright paint now dulled by years of salt air and neglect. Simon stepped out of his car, his shoes crunching on gravel and dead leaves. To the left of the house, he spotted the remains of what must have been a goat pen, its wooden posts collapsed inward like fallen soldiers. Everything matched Eli's painting with an accuracy that made Simon's hands tremble. Marcus approached, his footsteps careful and measured. "Place has been empty for a while," he observed, pointing to the thick growth of weeds around the foundation. "But someone maintained it until relatively recently, maybe a year ago, judging by the vegetation patterns." Simon nodded mutely, his eyes fixed on the red door. Each step toward it felt heavy with significance. Marcus moved ahead with a small toolkit, checking the door's stability before attempting to open it. The lock was simple, worn with age, and yielded easily to his practiced touch. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of stale air. Simon hesitated at the threshold, suddenly uncertain. Inside lay answers he'd sought for 5 years. But what if they were answers he couldn't bear to hear? Marcus switched on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior. "Power's long gone," he said quietly, "but there's enough natural light to see." They stepped inside. The house was modest, but had been kept meticulously clean until its abandonment. Dust lay thick on every surface now, but beneath it, Simon could see the care that had gone into maintaining the space. A teacup sat on a windowsill, unwashed and forgotten, as if its owner had stepped out expecting to return any moment. In a corner, a wooden basket held neatly folded children's clothes. Simon approached slowly, his heart pounding. The garments were hand-stitched, made with careful attention to detail. He recognized the style. Eli had been wearing similar clothes when he appeared at Simon's door. But it was the walls that drew his attention most forcefully. They were covered in paintings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all clearly done by a child's hand, showing the progression of skill over years. Simon moved from one to another, his throat tight. Here was the ocean, there the yellow truck, a garden with goats, the house itself, viewed from different angles. And then he saw it, a painting that made his knees weak. It showed a baby cradled in the arms of an older woman with silver braids wound around her head. The woman's face was kind, her posture protective. The baby wore blue pajamas that Simon recognized with a jolt. They had been Eli's favorites. Marcus was moving methodically through the house, documenting everything with his camera. "Main bedroom's through here," he called softly. Simon followed him into a small room dominated by a neatly made bed. A rocking chair sat by the window, a half-finished knitting project still resting on its seat. The walls here held more paintings but also photographs, old ones, showing the woman with silver braids in her younger years. Maeve Wren, Simon remembered, the nurse who had vanished from records. Marcus opened the dresser drawers carefully, photographing their contents. In the second drawer, beneath carefully folded sweaters, he paused. "Mr. Alden, you should see this." Simon moved closer. Marcus held up an envelope, yellowed with age but clearly preserved with care. On its front, written in steady handwriting, were the words, "In case of my death." Below that, "To the boy's father." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Simon took the envelope. The paper felt fragile in his shaking hands, as if it might crumble under the weight of its own significance. Here, finally, was the truth. The story of 5 lost years, the explanation for his son's survival, the answer to questions that had haunted his sleepless nights. He stood there, holding the envelope, aware of Marcus's respectful silence, of the dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight, of the distant sound of waves against the cliffs below. The letter waited, patient as time itself, ready to reveal its secrets. Simon sat at the weathered kitchen table, sunlight filtering through dusty windows to cast long shadows across the worn wooden surface. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in his lap, its edges slightly frayed with age. Through the window, he could see Eli in the overgrown garden, carefully examining wildflowers while Marcus kept a watchful distance. His son moved with such careful deliberation, touching each plant with gentle curiosity, a trait Simon now realized must have come from years of exploring this very garden. The thought made his chest tighten. 5 years of memories he'd never witnessed, all contained within these neglected walls. With trembling fingers, Simon broke the seal of the envelope. The paper inside was thick, good quality, covered in flowing handwriting that spoke of careful consideration. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases before beginning to read. "Dear Mr. Alden, I pray that when you read these words you will find it in your heart to understand, if not forgive, the choices I made. My name is Maeve Wren. I was once a trauma nurse at Coastal General, until circumstances forced me to retreat from the world. I am the woman who found and kept your son. It was during one of my morning walks along the cliffs, 3 days after the storm that took your wife. The tide was unusually low, revealing a small cove I'd never noticed before. That's where I found him, a baby boy, somehow caught in a natural cradle of rocks, wrapped in a torn life vest and a blanket patterned with whales. He was cold but breathing, protected from the worst of the elements by some miracle I still don't understand. I recognized him immediately. Your family's tragedy was all over the news, the architect's wife and baby lost at sea. I knew I should have called the authorities. I knew it was wrong to keep silent. But in that moment, all I could think about was my daughter, Sarah, and how the system failed her child, my grandchild. How they placed him with strangers who hurt him, despite all my warnings and pleas. How I lost them both because I trusted the wrong people. The blanket had Eli stitched in the corner. I took it as a sign, though perhaps I was only justifying what I already knew I would do. I brought him home, warmed him, fed him. He was so small, so trusting. When he smiled at me that first evening, I convinced myself I was protecting him from a world that had already proven itself cruel. I kept every news article about the search. I followed your grief from afar, and it haunted me. But by then, weeks had passed. I told myself it was too late to come forward, that he was thriving here, safe and loved. I convinced myself that the system would only hurt him as it had hurt my grandson. But I never let him forget you. I showed him your pictures from the newspapers, told him stories about the man with the whale, his father who loved him so much he never stopped looking. I kept the whale rock he arrived with, telling him it was a special connection to his past. When he was old enough to understand more, I planned to bring him to you myself. I wanted him to know he wasn't abandoned, that he had 2 people who loved him enough to protect him in their own ways. I taught him to paint because he was so quiet, so observant. Like you, he sees the world in shapes and colors. He draws the same way you design, with purpose and vision. He's your son in so many ways, Mr. Alden. He has your patience, your gentle spirit, your ability to find beauty in silence. The hardest part was watching him grow, knowing each day brought me closer to losing him. But he was never truly mine to lose. He was always yours, from the moment he drew his first breath. I was just a temporary guardian, keeping him safe until he could find his way back to you. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Forgive me, he was always yours. The letter trembled in Simon's hands as the tears began to fall, silent at first, then building into deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. 5 years of carefully maintained control crumbled in an instant. He cried for the lost time, for Maeve's impossible choice, for his son who had been loved and protected when he thought him lost forever. Through his tears, he looked out at Eli in the garden. The boy had found a patch of wildflowers and was arranging them carefully by color, just as Simon organized his architectural materials. The sight made him cry harder. All the little pieces of himself he could now see reflected in his son's careful movements. The tears kept coming, years of suppressed grief and joy mixing together until Simon could no longer tell the difference. He clutched the letter to his chest, bowing his head over the kitchen table where his son had likely eaten hundreds of meals, where Maeve had watched him grow, where two kinds of love, desperate and pure, had somehow merged to bring Eli home. The drive home from Maeve's cabin was quiet, filled with the gentle hum of tires on pavement and Eli's soft breathing from the back seat. Simon kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching his son drift in and out of sleep, the whale rock cradled in his small arms. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the coastal road, painting everything in warm, golden light. When they pulled into the mansion's circular driveway, Simon noticed how different everything looked now. The towering house no longer felt like a monument to loss, but rather a place waiting to be filled with new memories. He helped a sleepy Eli from the car, carrying both him and a small box of items they'd gathered from Maeve's home. Photos, drawings, and small keepsakes that told the story of his son's missing years. Inside, Simon settled Eli with some paper and crayons at the kitchen table while he went to the garage. He returned with a shovel, a glass jar, and some supplies from his workshop. Through the window, he could see the mansion's backyard, once meticulously maintained, now wild and overgrown after years of neglect. It seemed fitting somehow, like nature itself had been waiting for this moment. "Would you like to help me with something special?" Simon asked Eli, who looked up from his drawing with curious eyes. The boy nodded, setting down his crayon and sliding off the chair. Together they walked out to the back porch. The evening air was cool and sweet with the smell of grass and earth. Simon led them to a spot near the edge of the yard where wildflowers had taken root in the untamed grass. It was the kind of place Maeve would have loved, natural, peaceful, alive with small beauties. Simon began to dig, careful and methodical. Eli watched from the porch steps, his eyes tracking every movement. The sound of the shovel cutting into earth filled the air, mixing with the distant crash of waves and the calling of seabirds. It felt like a ceremony of sorts, though Simon couldn't have explained exactly why. From his pocket, Simon pulled out Maeve's letter, now carefully folded and placed in a plastic sleeve. Next came a small framed photograph they'd found in her bedroom drawer. Maeve sitting in her garden, silver braids catching the sun. Her face creased with joy as she held a much younger Eli in her lap. The image captured everything about her that Simon had come to understand: her strength, her gentleness, her fierce and protective love. He placed both items in the glass jar, sealing it carefully. Before lowering it into the hole, he paused, looking at the photograph one last time. His throat felt tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said softly to the image of the woman who had saved his son. "Not as someone who could have given you anything you wanted, or as a man lost in grief, but as a father. You protected him when I couldn't. You loved him when I wasn't there. You kept him safe and helped him grow into this amazing little boy who somehow found his way back to me." Simon's voice cracked slightly. "I promise to honor what you did, to help him remember you with love, not sadness, to make sure he knows that sometimes the biggest acts of love don't follow the rules. They follow the heart." He placed the jar gently in the hole, then reached for the small sapling he'd brought from his workshop. It was a coastal oak, hardy and strong, the kind that could weather any storm. As he planted it beside the jar, Eli slowly made his way down from the porch, drawn by the quiet ceremony of the moment. Simon took out the wooden sign he'd made earlier, the letters carved deep and clear. Maeve's Garden. He set it carefully beside the sapling, making sure it stood straight and true. "This will grow tall and strong," he told Eli, who had come to stand beside him, "just like you did while Maeve watched over you. And whenever we miss her, we can come here and remember." Eli looked at the sign, then at the sapling. He turned and walked to the edge of the yard where wildflowers grew in tangles. With careful deliberation, he picked a single purple flower, the same kind that had grown in Maeve's garden. Walking back, he held it out to Simon with solemn purpose. Simon took the flower, understanding the weight of the gesture. Together, they placed it at the base of the sapling. The purple petals caught the last rays of sunset, glowing like a tiny flame against the dark earth. As dusk settled around them, Simon stood and held out his hand. Eli took it without hesitation, his small fingers wrapping trustingly around his father's. They walked back toward the house, leaving Maeve's garden to the gentle evening air and the first stars appearing overhead. At the hallway entrance, Simon paused. For 5 years, he'd left lights burning throughout the house, as if brightness could ward off the shadows of loss. But now, looking down at his son's face in the warm glow, he realized those shadows had finally lifted. With a small smile, he reached out and flipped the switch, letting darkness settle naturally through the corridor. The house no longer needed to hide behind artificial light. It could rest in the peaceful dark, knowing that morning would bring new day, new hope, new life, just as Maeve had always believed it would. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as Simon stood in the doorway of the mansion's guest wing, surveying the space with new eyes. The room was massive, easily the size of a small gallery, with vaulted ceilings and warm hardwood floors that had sat unused for years. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams as he walked the perimeter, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He began methodically the way he approached all his projects. First came the clearing, removing heavy antique furniture, rolling up oriental rugs, taking down ornate curtains that had blocked much of the natural light. Each piece carried memories of a different life, when the house had been filled with society gatherings and polite conversation. Now it would serve a different purpose. Eli watched from the doorway as Simon worked, clutching his ever-present whale rock. The boy's eyes followed his father's movements with quiet intensity, particularly when Simon began laying out painting supplies, drop cloths, rollers, brushes, and gallons of paint in various shades of ocean blue. "Want to help?" Simon asked, holding out a small roller. Eli nodded, patting across the floor in his sock feet. Together they started on the first wall, Simon showing him how to dip the roller and apply even pressure. The blue paint transformed the space as they worked, turning stark white walls into something that felt alive with movement, like being underwater. By afternoon, the walls were finished, and Simon began bringing in the new furniture he'd ordered. Simple wooden tables designed for art projects, comfortable chairs that could be easily moved, floor-to-ceiling shelves that he carefully stocked with blank canvases, watercolors, clay, and every kind of art supply he could think of. Each item was chosen with purpose, nothing too precious or intimidating, everything meant to be used and explored. When Dana arrived for her scheduled home visit the next day, she paused in the doorway of the whale room, her professional demeanor briefly slipping into genuine surprise. "This is unexpected," she said, walking into the space and touching one of the easels. "What inspired this?" Simon stood beside her, watching Eli arrange paintbrushes at one of the tables. "I've been thinking about what Maeve did for Eli, how she used art to help him express himself when words wouldn't come. There are so many children out there carrying heavy stories they can't tell." He gestured to the room. "This won't be anything formal or public. No media, no grand opening. Just a quiet space where foster children and orphans can come to paint, draw, or create. Somewhere they can feel safe letting their stories out, even if only in colors and shapes." Dana nodded slowly, her eyes taking in the thoughtful details. The comfortable reading nook in one corner, the low tables perfect for small hands, the natural light that filled every corner. You've put a lot of thought into this. I had good teachers, Simon said softly, watching Eli. A boy who speaks through pictures, and a woman who understood that sometimes the biggest healings happen in the smallest ways. They watched as Eli approached the largest wall of the room, still blank and waiting. He tugged on Simon's sleeve and pointed to it, then held up a paintbrush questioningly. Of course, Simon said, understanding immediately. He helped Eli set up a stepladder and mixed several shades of deep blue and gray paint. Together they began sketching out the shape of a massive whale that would span the wall from floor to ceiling. Dana observed them working together, Simon lifting Eli to reach higher spots, Eli directing with gestures where each color should go, their movements naturally synchronized, like they'd been painting together for years instead of days. As the whale took shape, something remarkable happened. Eli smiled. Not just a small twitch of lips, but a full, bright smile that transformed his whole face. He's thriving, Dana said quietly, making notes in her folder. The change in just these few weeks is remarkable. You've created something very special here, Mr. Alden. Simon stepped back from the wall, paint splattered on his clothes, and watched Eli add final touches to the whale's eye. No, he said, we're creating it together. They worked on the whale mural through the afternoon, adding details that made it seem to swim through the blue walls, streams of bubbles, swaying seaweed, tiny fish darting in its wake. When they finished, Eli stood back and studied their work with serious concentration before nodding in approval. It needs a name, Simon said, looking around the transformed space. This room, I mean. He thought about the painted rock that had guided Eli home, about the whale they'd just created together, about all the stories waiting to be told on these walls. What do you think about calling it the Whale Room? Eli's eyes lit up. He hurried to his art table and grabbed a piece of paper, quickly drawing what looked like a sign with wobbly letters spelling out the Whale Room. He held it up proudly. Perfect, Simon said. We'll make a proper sign tomorrow. That evening, after dinner and a warm bath, Simon expected their usual routine, Eli heading to his room with his blanket and whale rock while Simon stayed nearby until he fell asleep. But tonight was different. Eli gathered his sleeping things and instead of turning toward his own room, he walked straight into Simon's bedroom. Simon watched, heart swelling, as his son climbed onto the big bed and arranged his blanket and pillow on one side, leaving plenty of space beside him. There was no hesitation in his movements, no fear or uncertainty. He simply settled in and looked at Simon expectantly, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Understanding the profound trust in this simple act, Simon changed into his own pajamas and joined Eli on the bed. His son immediately curled closer, the whale rock tucked between them like a bridge connecting their two worlds. The late summer sun hung warm and bright in the afternoon sky as Simon packed their art supplies into a woven basket. Eli helped by carefully wrapping his favorite brushes in a soft cloth, treating each one like a precious treasure. They had chosen this particular beach for its seclusion, a small crescent of sand tucked away from the tourist spots, protected by weathered cliffs on both sides. Simon carried the basket while Eli clutched his whale rock, their feet making soft impressions in the sand as they walked. The beach was empty, except for a few seabirds swooping low over the gentle waves. It was the kind of day that seemed to stretch endlessly, full of possibility and peace. They set up their workspace with practiced ease, a large blanket spread across the sand, weighted down with smooth stones at the corners. Simon arranged their easels side by side, making sure Eli's was adjusted to the perfect height. The boy had grown more confident with his art supplies over the past weeks, knowing exactly which brushes he preferred and mixing colors with careful precision. The sound of waves provided a soothing rhythm as they began to paint. Simon chose to capture the scene before them, the way sunlight danced on the water's surface, creating a constantly shifting palette of blues and greens. His brush moved in sure strokes, building layers of color that mimicked the ocean's depth. Beside him, Eli worked with intense focus. His small hands moved deliberately across his canvas, starting with bold lines that gradually took shape. Simon glanced over occasionally, watching as his son's picture emerged. A steep cliff face, remarkably similar to the ones surrounding them, and atop it, a figure holding something in their arms. The afternoon light softened as they painted, casting long shadows across their canvases. A gentle breeze carried the salt spray, and Simon noticed how Eli's hair ruffled in the wind, the same way Leah's used to. These quiet moments of recognition no longer brought sharp pain, but rather a warm ache, like touching a healing wound. Eli added more details to his painting. The figure on the cliff had silver braids, and in their arms was clearly a baby wrapped in what looked like a blanket. Simon recognized the scene immediately, Maeve finding Eli on that stormy night, though he knew his son was too young to actually remember it. The story had lived in Eli's mind through Maeve's tellings, becoming part of his personal mythology. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Simon started packing up their supplies. He carefully stored their wet canvases in the carrying case he'd designed specifically for transporting art, making sure nothing would smudge. Eli helped by gathering their brushes, counting each one twice as he always did. Simon was just folding the blanket when he felt a small tug on his sleeve. He looked down to find Eli staring up at him with an expression of deep contemplation, his eyes serious and clear. The boy's hand still gripped Simon's sleeve, but it wasn't the desperate clutch of earlier days. It was gentle, assured. Then, in a voice soft but steady, Eli spoke. "You're the man from her stories." Simon's breath caught in his throat. Though Eli had said a few words since that first "mama," they had been simple things. Yes, no, please. This was different. This was a complete thought, a connection being made explicit at last. Slowly, carefully, Simon knelt in the sand until he was at eye level with his son. He reached out and cradled Eli's face gently between his hands, feeling the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of him. The boy who had been lost and found, who had lived in his heart as a ghost for 5 years, was here, speaking, understanding, connecting their shared past. "And you're the boy I never stopped waiting for," Simon whispered, his voice thick with emotion but steady. They stayed like that for a moment, the waves providing a gentle soundtrack to their revelation. Then Eli nodded once, decisively, as if confirming something he had long suspected. He picked up his whale rock from where it sat on the sand and took Simon's hand. Together they walked toward home, their footprints making parallel tracks in the sand. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting their shadows long across the beach. But unlike the shadows that had haunted the mansion for so many years, these were warm and companionable, moving in sync as father and son made their way home. The familiar silhouette of the mansion appeared as they crested the last hill. Its windows caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like welcome beacons. No longer did it loom like a monument to loss. Now it stood proud and welcoming, a home restored to life. They climbed the steps to the front door, sand still clinging to their shoes, the basket of art supplies swinging gently between them. Simon unlocked the door and held it open, watching as Eli stepped inside with confident familiarity. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing them into their shared sanctuary, no longer cold, no longer silent, but filled with the quiet warmth of family restored. The morning dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to rustle the cypress trees that lined the coastal cemetery's winding paths. Simon parked their car near the iron gates, taking a moment to study Eli in the rearview mirror. The boy sat quietly in his car seat, holding the whale rock in his lap and gazing out at the rows of headstones with solemn curiosity. Simon reached into the passenger seat and carefully lifted the wrapped plaque he'd had made. The engraving had taken several attempts to get right. He'd wanted the words to be perfect, to capture everything Maeve had meant without revealing too much. The stonemason had finally understood, creating something simple but meaningful. "Ready?" Simon asked softly, turning to look at Eli. The boy nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt with practiced ease. He was wearing the blue sweater they'd bought together last week, his first time choosing his own clothes at a store. The color reminded Simon of the ocean on calm days. They walked together through the gates, their shoes crunching quietly on the gravel path. Simon had visited this spot countless times over the past 5 years, but never with company. The familiar weight of grief felt different now, transformed by Eli's presence beside him. The path to Leah's grave wound passed ancient oak trees and carefully tended flower beds. Simon had chosen this spot for its view of the ocean, knowing how much Leah had loved watching the waves. Her headstone stood beneath the spreading branches of a mature maple tree, its leaves just beginning to hint at autumn colors. As they approached, Simon felt Eli's pace slow slightly. He looked down to find his son studying the surrounding markers with intense focus, reading the names he could recognize. When they reached Leah's stone, Eli stopped completely, his grip tightening on the whale rock. The headstone was simple but elegant, carved from pale gray granite. Leah Marie Alden, it read, followed by the dates that marked her too brief life. Below that was the inscription Simon had chosen: "Beloved wife and mother, whose love still echoes in the waves." Simon knelt beside the grave, gently setting down the wrapped plaque. He felt Eli move closer, standing just behind his shoulder. The morning sun cast their shadows across Leah's name, merging them into one shape on the stone. "Hi, Leah," Simon began, his voice soft but steady. "I've brought someone to see you. Someone we've both been waiting for." He reached back and gently drew Eli forward, keeping one hand on his small shoulder. "This is our Eli. Not the baby we lost that day, but the amazing boy he's grown into." Eli stepped forward, his movements careful and deliberate. He knelt beside Simon and placed the whale rock at the base of the headstone, positioning it so the painted eyes faced the engraved name. "He's quiet most of the time," Simon continued, "but his heart is so full of love. He paints beautiful pictures, just like you did. And sometimes, when he's really happy, he hums that lullaby you used to sing." Simon's voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. "He found his way back to us, Leah. Not the way we expected, but maybe exactly the way he needed to." A warm breeze stirred the maple leaves above them, sending dappled sunlight dancing across the grave. Simon unwrapped the plaque he'd brought, revealing the freshly carved stone. It was smaller than Leah's marker, but made of the same granite, designed to complement rather than compete. "And there's someone else you should meet," Simon said, lifting the plaque. "Someone who watched over him when we couldn't." He carefully began installing the plaque beside Leah's headstone, using the mounting brackets he'd prepared earlier. Her name was Maeve Wren. The new plaque settled into place with a soft click. Its simple inscription read exactly as Simon had planned. Maeve Wren, the woman who watched over him. No dates, no additional details, just the truth that mattered most. Eli reached out and traced the letters of Maeve's name with one finger, his touch as gentle as if he were handling one of his paintbrushes. Simon watched him, understanding the complex emotions behind that careful gesture. How strange it must be, he thought, to see both mothers' names here together, the one he'd lost before memory, and the one who'd raised him in secret solitude. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of waves and the closer songs of morning birds. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool granite beneath their hands. Simon found himself remembering Leah's laugh, the way she used to dance while painting, how she'd promised their baby would grow up surrounded by art and music and love. In a way, he realized, that promise had been kept, just not as they'd planned. Finally, Simon stood, brushing grass from his knees. "Time to go, buddy," he said softly. Eli nodded and got to his feet, taking one last look at the two markers side by side. As they walked back along the winding path, Eli's small hand slipped into Simon's without prompting. His grip was warm and sure, nothing like the desperate clutching of those first uncertain days. They'd nearly reached the iron gates when Eli spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Will she see the sign?" Simon paused, looking down at his son's upturned face. The question held no fear or sadness, just genuine curiosity. Simon squeezed his hand gently. "She already knows it's there," he answered softly. They continued walking, leaving behind the two gravestones nestled beneath the maple tree, one weathered by 5 years of sun and storm, the other fresh and new, but both bearing names of women who had shaped one boy's remarkable journey home. The morning light caught the granite surfaces, making them glow like beacons in the quiet cemetery, while the painted whale rock kept its eternal watch over them both. The whale room hummed with gentle activity on a bright autumn morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above art tables, where children sat working quietly with brushes and paints. The walls, once stark and empty, now displayed a growing collection of artwork, each piece telling its own story of healing and hope. Simon stood near the supply cabinet, organizing new sets of watercolors while watching Eli move confidently among the other children. His son, the word still caught in his throat sometimes with its miraculous weight, carefully helped a young girl select the right brush for her painting, explaining in his soft but clear voice how different bristles created different effects. "The fat ones are good for big spaces," Eli said, demonstrating with a gentle sweep of his hand. "Like when you're painting the whole sky." Dana sat in a corner, her notebook open but forgotten as she observed the natural flow of interaction. She'd been instrumental in connecting Simon with a local program for children in transitional care, recognizing that the whale room could offer something unique, a quiet space where creativity could help unlock trapped emotions. "Dad," Eli called out, the word flowing naturally now, "we need more blue paint." Simon's heart swelled, as it did every time Eli called him that. He retrieved a fresh tube of cerulean blue from the cabinet, remembering how those first hesitant dads had emerged, tentative at first, then growing stronger with each passing day like seedlings reaching for sunlight. The afternoon passed in peaceful productivity, punctuated by occasional whispers and the soft swish of brushes on paper. When the last child had been picked up, Eli helped Simon clean the brushes, his small hands moving with careful precision under the running water. "Can we have pasta tonight?" Eli asked, reaching for a towel to dry his hands. "Sounds perfect," Simon replied, amazed as always by how ordinary moments could feel so extraordinary now. In the kitchen, Simon began preparing dinner while Eli moved around the table, placing forks and napkins with methodical care. Classical music filled the space, one of Leah's favorite pieces, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Simon had started playing music again recently, letting memories become comfort rather than pain. The kitchen windows framed a spectacular sunset, painting the sky in shades that reminded Simon of Eli's latest artwork. As he stirred the pasta sauce, he watched his son adjust each place setting until it was exactly right, humming along with the melody as if he'd known it all his life. "Perfect," Simon said, nodding at Eli's handiwork. "Just like your mother used to do it." Eli smiled, a quick flash that lit up his whole face. These mentions of Leah no longer brought shadows to his eyes. Instead, they seemed to help him piece together the puzzle of his own story, connecting past to present with growing understanding. After dinner, Simon led Eli out to the dock behind the house. The evening air was cool, but not cold, carrying the salt-sweet scent of the ocean. They sat at the edge, their feet dangling above the gentle waves that lapped at the wooden posts below. "I have something for you," Simon said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small, smooth rock, similar in size to the original whale rock, but with a new design painted on its surface. A family of whales swam across its polished face, one large, one medium, and one small, their forms gracefully intertwined in shades of blue and gray. "You can add to it," Simon explained, placing it in Eli's outstretched hand. "Make it your own." Eli turned the rock over in his palms, studying the design with the same intense focus he brought to his paintings. His fingers traced the curves of the whale family, lingering on the smallest one. "Thank you," he said softly, slipping the rock into his pocket with careful reverence. They sat together as the sky darkened and stars began to appear, reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. The silence between them was comfortable now, full of shared understanding rather than unspoken fears. Later that evening, after Simon had finished cleaning up the kitchen, he noticed Eli slip quietly into the whale room alone. He followed silently, pausing in the doorway to watch as his son picked up a fine-tipped brush and approached the large mural on the far wall. The painted whale that dominated the scene had become a centerpiece of the room, its massive form seeming to swim through waves of blue and green. Now, Eli dipped his brush in red paint and, with careful precision, added one final detail to the background: a tiny red door nestled against the painted cliffside next to the whale. Simon felt tears prick at his eyes as he watched. That small red door contained volumes of meaning: acknowledgement, acceptance, gratitude. It was Eli's way of weaving all the threads of his story together, honoring both the path that had led him here and the home he'd found at last. Sometimes love gets lost in the waves, but if it's real, it finds its way back. The house glowed with warm light as evening settled fully into night, its windows bright against the darkening sky. No longer a mansion haunted by loss and silence, it had become simply a home, filled with art and music, memories and hope, and the quiet miracle of family found again. If you enjoyed the story of Simon and Eli, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.